My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 34 years old, and 6 weeks ago, my brother threw a dinner plate against the wall of the house my grandparents left me, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "This place was never really yours." My parents sat right there at that table and said absolutely nothing. I want you to stay with me until the end of this story because what happened next changed everything, for all of them. But first, let me take you back to where it really started. It was a Friday evening in late November, and I'd spent the better part of the afternoon in the kitchen of my home in Asheville, North Carolina, making Grandma Ruth's pot roast from memory. Chuck roast, slow cooked with carrots, baby potatoes, and a handful of fresh rosemary from the little herb pot on the windowsill. The whole house smelled like every good Thanksgiving I'd ever had. I'd set the table with the good plates, the blue-rimmed ceramic ones Ruth kept in the hutch, and folded the cloth napkins into triangles the way she used to do. I was trying. I want you to understand that. I was genuinely, sincerely trying. My brother, Tyler Donovan, 29 years old, arrived 45 minutes late with my parents, Sandra and Gary Donovan, like the three of them always traveled in a pack. My mother handed me a grocery store cheesecake at the door, the plastic-wrapped kind with the cardboard bottom, and said something about traffic on I-26. My father walked straight past me into the living room and turned on the TV before I'd even closed the front door. I told myself it was fine. I smiled. I poured glasses of sweet tea and set out a cheese board I'd arranged earlier that afternoon, and I sat down and I told myself, tonight is going to be different. It wasn't. Conversation started the way it always did. My mother talking about her garden club, my father talking about his buddy Dave's new truck, Tyler sprawled in Grandpa Walter's old armchair scrolling his phone like a teenager. I mentioned a project I'd been working on. I'm a civil engineer, had just gotten lead on a bridge rehabilitation project for the county, and my mother said, "That's wonderful, Claire," in the tone people use when they mean, "moving on now," and turned immediately to Tyler. "Have you heard back from that investor?" she asked him, leaning forward like she was waiting on news about a moon landing. Tyler's latest venture was a custom furniture business he'd started 8 months earlier. It hadn't turned a single dollar of profit. He'd already borrowed $11,000 from my parents to get it off the ground, and from what I could gather, most of that had gone to a logo designer and a booth at a craft fair in Greenville that generated $400 in sales. "These things take time," Tyler said, shrugging. "People don't understand the vision." My father nodded gravely. "Craftsmanship is a dying art, son." I bit the inside of my cheek and passed the bread. Then my mother set down her fork and looked at me with that particular expression of hers, too casual, too studied, and said, "Have you thought any more about the upstairs situation? Tyler was saying the workshop lighting in there is actually pretty ideal for furniture work." The room went very still inside my chest. "The upstairs is my home office." "It's a lot of house for one person," my mother said. Tyler straightened up in the armchair. He wasn't scrolling his phone anymore. "Claire, I need a real space to build. This house has the garage, the upstairs, the whole back lot. You're barely using half of it. It makes sense." "It makes sense for you," I said evenly. "It's my house." My father cleared his throat. "It's a family house." And there it was, that phrase, the one I'd been waiting for and dreading at the same time. It's a family house, as if Walter and Ruth Calloway, my grandparents, who raised me, who taught me to read blueprints on their kitchen table, who left this house to me and me alone in a will witnessed by 3 people and notarized by a lawyer on Merriman Avenue, had somehow left it to everyone. Grandma and Grandpa left it to me, not to the family, to me. It's in the will. Tyler's jaw tightened. "Don't act like you're special because they liked you better." "I don't think I'm special. I think I'm the legal owner." "You've always done this," he snapped, pushing back from the table. "Always with the technically and the legally, and acting like you're the only one who ever did anything right. You know what your problem is, Claire? You think a good GPA makes you better than people." "I never said—" "You didn't have to." He grabbed the dinner plate in front of him, I watched it happen like slow motion, and threw it against the wall beside the kitchen doorway. It didn't shatter the way you imagine. It made a dull, heavy crack and left a gray scuff on the white paint and landed in 2 pieces on the hardwood floor that Grandpa Walter had refinished in 1987. "This is my house too," Tyler said, pointing at me, "and you need to stop acting like you own everything." My mother put her hand over her mouth. My father looked at the floor. Neither of them said a word. I stood up. My voice was steadier than I expected. "I'd like you all to leave now." Tyler walked out first, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the window frames. My parents followed, my mother pausing to say, "He didn't mean it, Claire. He's just under a lot of stress." My father didn't say anything at all. I stood in my kitchen alone, the pot roast still steaming on the table, Ruth's blue-rimmed plates set out in a row, and one of them in pieces on the floor. I looked at that broken plate for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called my best friend, Mara Chen. Mara and I had been friends since freshman year at UNC Asheville. She was a paralegal now, sharp as a tack, and she answered on the second ring. I told her everything, my voice low and flat, the way it gets when I'm past the crying stage and into the cold clarity stage. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Claire, do you know if they've been using the house?" I thought about it. Tyler had a key. I'd given him one 2 years ago so he could water my plants when I was away for a work conference. My mother had mentioned stopping by a few times. I'd noticed things subtly rearranged in the garage. His belt sander had appeared on the workbench one day, and I had assumed he'd asked and I'd forgotten. "I think they might be using the space without really asking," I said slowly. "That's trespassing, and depending on the frequency and the nature of it, it could be more than that. Send me the will and the deed tonight." I sat at the antique desk that had been Grandma Ruth's, opened my laptop, and pulled up the digital copies of every document I had. I emailed them to Mara at 11 o'clock at night, and then I sat there in the quiet of the house on Birchwood Lane, the house where I spent every summer of my childhood, where Ruth had spread blueprints of local buildings across the dining table and taught me how to read blueprints, where Walter had shown me how to change a fuse box and wire a light switch, and I made myself a decision. I was done accommodating. I was done minimizing. I was done pretending that the people who were supposed to protect me weren't the same people always standing at the door with their hands out. Let me tell you something about growing up the Donovan family in Asheville, North Carolina. My parents, Sandra and Gary, had 2 children, me and then Tyler 3 years later. From about the time Tyler turned 8 and decided he was an entrepreneur, the household rearranged itself around his potential. I don't say this with bitterness, I say it because it is simply the accurate description of my childhood. When I was 15, I needed a graphing calculator for advanced math. My mother said they were stretched too thin. 3 weeks later, Tyler got a brand new laptop for his game design ideas. I bought the calculator with babysitting money and carried it in a Ziploc bag because the case had cracked. When I was 17, I got a 4.1 GPA and a full academic scholarship offer to UNC Asheville's engineering program. My parents took me out to dinner at an Applebee's. When Tyler, at 17, announced he wanted to attend a 2-week entrepreneurship camp in Charlotte, they paid the $800 registration fee without blinking and threw him a little party. My college fund, which I only discovered in my freshman year, had been quietly redirected into Tyler's first business venture when I was 18, a screen printing operation he'd set up in the garage that lasted 5 months. My mother called it unexpected family expenses when I finally asked directly. I worked 25 hours a week at a civil engineering firm's front desk to cover my living costs through college, pulling a 3.9 GPA in a field that does not make a 3.9 easy. My grandparents, Ruth and Walter Calloway, my mother's parents, saw all of it. Ruth would call me every Sunday morning, her voice steady and warm over the phone, and she would say, "You are building something real, Claire. Don't let their noise knock you off course." Walter, a man of maybe 40 words a day, once looked up from the old drafting table in his study while I was venting about the college fund and said, People who take shortcuts end up right back at the beginning. You won't. When they passed, Walter first, then Ruth 14 months later, they left the house on Birchwood Lane to me. Just me. 3 bedrooms, a workshop garage, a back garden that Ruth had tended for 30 years, and a property value that had climbed to nearly $400,000 in Asheville's increasingly expensive market. The will had been drafted by their attorney, David Harmon, signed by 3 witnesses, and filed with the county. Tyler had shown up to the reading in a Supreme hoodie and spent the whole time on his phone. When the attorney read my name as sole inheritor, Tyler had laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound, and said, "Seriously?" That was 3 years ago. I'd invested my own savings into the house since then: new insulation, refinished floors, a security system, and a fresh coat of paint on Ruth's garden shed. And Tyler, it turned out, had apparently decided the house was his workshop. Mara called me Saturday morning, 2 days after the dinner. "The will is airtight," she said. 3 witnesses, a physician's attestation on Ruth's mental clarity, and it's been 3 years, so the statute of limitations on contesting it in North Carolina has long passed. Here's the part you need to hear, Claire. Tyler has been using your garage regularly. His equipment is in there. That's unauthorized use of private property. You can issue a formal notice to vacate and remove his belongings. If he doesn't comply, you can involve the sheriff. I was quiet for a moment. "My parents still have a key," I said. "Change the locks today," Mara said. I had a locksmith there by noon. That afternoon, I put together a package with Mara's help: certified copies of Ruth and Walter's will, the property deed in my name, a formal written notice to Tyler requiring him to remove all personal property from my garage within 72 hours, and a letter, calm, factual, 3 paragraphs, to my parents informing them that their key had been deactivated and they were not to enter the property without my explicit written permission going forward. I shipped it certified mail. I took photos of everything, and then I drove 4 hours east to Raleigh for a work conference, turned my phone to silent, and let it land. The voicemails started by evening. My mother: "Claire, what is this? Call me right now. This is not what family does." Tyler: "You think you're so much better than me. This isn't over." My father, flat and brief: "You've made your point. Call your mother." I listened to all of them once in my hotel room, then set the phone face down on the nightstand and ordered room service and watched the news. By the following week, Tyler had hired a local attorney, a guy named Brett Sommer, who sent Mara a letter suggesting the property might constitute a family estate asset. Mara forwarded it to me with 2 words: "Absolutely not." She wrote back citing the will, the deed, the 3-year statute, and the unauthorized use of my property, and informed Brett Sommer that if Tyler did not remove his equipment from my garage by the end of the week, we would be pursuing a formal complaint. Tyler's belongings were gone from the garage by Thursday. Brett Sommer sent 1 more email. Mara replied 1 more. Then there was silence. The fallout, when it came quietly. Tyler's furniture business collapsed 2 months later. Without access to a free workshop space, he'd had to rent a unit in an industrial park on the south side of Asheville, and the overhead swallowed whatever thin margins he had. My parents, who had co-signed a small business loan for him, found themselves on the hook for nearly $18,000. My father, who had retired early and was living on a fixed income, had to go back to work part-time to manage the payments. My mother stopped going to her garden club. I heard through a cousin that she'd told people she was taking a break, but the truth was she'd been too embarrassed to face questions. Tyler moved into a studio apartment across town. His social media, once full of polished furniture shots and motivational captions, went quiet. I heard all of this secondhand and said nothing. Mara and I had lunch at a cafe on Broadway one afternoon, and she looked at me over her iced coffee and said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. "Lighter," I said. I wasn't gleeful, I want to be clear about that. I took no pleasure in watching my parents struggle or my brother fail, but I had spent 34 years absorbing the cost of their choices: my college fund, my peace of mind, my property, my sense of worth. I didn't build their cage, they did. Today, I'm sitting at the antique desk that belonged to Grandma Ruth in the house on Birchwood Lane. The garden out back is coming up beautifully this spring. I planted coneflowers along the south fence the way Ruth always wanted to. The garage is mine again. The locks are new. There's a framed photo on the wall by the door. Me and Walter and Ruth on this porch in the summer of 2009. Ruth's hand on my shoulder. I'm not angry anymore. That's the thing about finally standing your ground. The anger doesn't stick around because it doesn't need to. It did its job. It got me here. I have my house, I have my career, I have Mara and a handful of people who love me without conditions. And I have one thing Tyler never understood about our grandparents. They didn't leave me this house because they liked me better. They left it to me because they knew I would take care of it, because I always had. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do for the people who've taken from you is simply to stop letting them. That's my story, and this house, it's still standing.